Hi, and welcome to Module 4, Case Study and Concept Development. Before we begin this module, as I always do in my other modules, make sure you have all the material I printed off for you in Module 4. The examples I'm going to give for you today on this video, you actually have in your module, so print those off, but sometimes you can't read the print up here. I just want to run through these and kind of go through the lesson plans and kind of give you an idea how this might look in the classroom. First thing I want to talk about is case studies, and case studies is personally my favorite out of all the different lessons. Case studies and values we'll be talking about next week. Case studies are actually good because it forces students to become active participants and active learners. And often in the classroom we have today with high-stakes testing, teachers need to get a large amount of information out. Well, you can still do that large amount of information, and then to show mastery of the material or to try to bring it to a different level of blooms, if all possible, you might be able to use a case study. Case studies are easy for the most part because they're one-step processes. The difficulties in case studies is that often you've got to find multiple documents. But in today's age of the internet and the availability of things you can get at school, it's probably not going to be that difficult. But the key thing is when we talk about case studies, and the importance of case studies is that you're making students become critically and logically thinking. We want them to look at information, compare and contrast, and then come up with the best solution. Case studies generally focus on three things. They look at written accounts, but they can be presented verbally. Now the problem with doing something verbally is that some of your students are going to be visual learners, or they like to read, and so by having a written account it might be easier to do it that way. Doing it verbally, you might find yourself constantly repeating it over and over and over. So sometimes you got to ask yourself, is the headache worth it by doing it verbally, or is it worth it having a couple of documents? Usually it has more than one possible outcome, and that's important because we're trying to get students to really deduce and to really kind of look into the material to think about what ways best works for them, and also which document is probably the most legitimate, most credible. And usually consists of 2 or more documents. However, I have seen it before, and I have several documents that I can provide for you for examples, where you have a single document for a case study. For example, I have a case study document that I believe I can find for you. It's called the Dred Scott decision, and it's simply one page. And it really allows the students to look in and discover and think about the issue of personal property versus states' rights. And we're talking the 1850s. So it's a different from today in terms of personal property versus state rights. But these are the 3 characteristics that come around when it comes to case studies. Usually a written account, we have more than one outcome, and usually we have 2 or more documents. Most of the ones I work with have at least 3 or 4 documents. And that's just what I have. Now you can find other things that make it work for you. A couple of characteristics, 2 ways to reach a decision, a conclusion when it comes to case studies is we often look at things as inductive or deductive, or inductive or discovery. And what I mean by that is when we teach our students, we have them reach their own conclusions. This is usually done through either an open-ended or a closed-ended approach. And really, you think about this when you're teaching in the classroom, or if you're out doing your observations, or you think back about when I was working and I taught in high school, or when you're a student in high school. When you're getting students to think about possible solutions and answers, it really comes down to 2 things. It doesn't make a difference how you cut the pie; it's still a pie. You're either doing it open-ended or you're doing it closed. If you're doing it open-ended, you're willing to entertain what those students come up with. And you might give them nudges and little suggestions along the way to give them suggestions of how it can become relevant, but you're really putting the faith into the students when it comes to open-ended. So for example, if we're trying to solve something, a social dilemma, or something that is taking place in society, open-ended is probably the way to go because you're asking the students to come up with their own ways of solutions and suggestions, and you give them ideas along the way, but really you're allowing them to come up with solutions, and that's what we're trying to do. And you can use this as a reinforcement to a lecture or direct instruction you have to do in the classroom. The other approach is, you have one, you're going to have the other, is closed, and that's where you're really kind of prompting and directing them in the right direction. I call it herding the corralling, because what you're doing is you're basically saying, okay guys, here's what I want you to do, and as you walk around, and you're walking through the classroom, you're monitoring, and if they're going off base, you kind of gently push them or give them a kick in the right direction, and you tell them, you put them in the right direction for the conclusion. A lot of times you'll see this if we're running out of time, or it's something that is maybe you're doing a state-tested topic and something very important, but you want to do the lecture first, and you want to say, hey, I want to do something, kind of an activity to help them out. you might have to do close to kind of push them in the right direction if they go off their own different path. And so sometimes a teacher is very tight controlled. A behavior style teaching strategy will use a closed-ended approach, while constructivist, which tends to be more open-ended, more wants to see the class come up with their own discussions and ideas, will be more open-ended. So really it boils down to when we're having the students look at how they're going to come up with something, it's open-ended or closed-ended. So which one is you depends on your time, personality. I like to be more open. I have friends that are more closed. So that's up to you. Now, the case study advantage. This is important because this kind of helps you in terms of what type of lesson am I going to use. Well, if you're wanting students to become active agents, you want them to be actively involved and participating, I recommend the case study. If you want them to analyze information and to develop a solution to the problems, then use a case study. And if you're teaching psychology, sociology, or even a government class, or even any kind of U.S. history class, or even econ, any of the social studies classes, if you're wanting students to analyze information and come up with some way of solving a problem that you give them, I would recommend the case study because these two areas are really important, active agents and developing solutions. Also, what we're looking for is for them to think about unstructured, ambiguous situations where they had to sit through and go through it step by step. There's one of the, talking about ambiguous situations, there's a case study I use, it's called Senator Williams, where you have step by step, you're given a handout of different scenarios that stack upon each other, and they keep on adding and adding and adding, and there's no way you can put your thumb on it and say this is exactly what's taking place. And I will post that into the module soon. Students must often decipher causes of events. And this is what we're trying to get students to do. Everything we're doing here is higher level Blooms. It's not having students write, list, recite, point, and the simple things on low level Blooms. We're getting students to look at things that they would do in regular society. That's what we're trying to do. And students develop the skills to persuade others. Watch students in a group. There's usually one or two strong-willed individuals in a group, and they tend to kind of push or persuade people to go their way. This is important because you're trying to have those social skills take place when the students are in small groups or even by themselves. They have to be by themselves. So this is the case study advantage. And so think about this when you're actually having the students, you design your lessons, what are you wanting the students to do? And that's the key here, okay? So let's look at the steps. There are procedures for the case study. There's only one type of procedure that's out there. You have introduction, learning experience, comprehension, and reinforcement. It's simple, 4 steps, that's it. You follow these steps, and you take this procedure, and you copy it into your lesson plan for case study. You take it, copy, drop it into your lesson plan we have for the class, and you've got a script right here. So introduce something, sets of cases, context, what is being studied. You're telling the students about the topic. You're kind of introducing the idea, the issue you're going to be talking about. Usually 99% of the time, if you're doing a lecture or something like that and you use this introduction has kind of been your lecture or your in-depth critical thinking you've done already. Your learning experience. Case studies distributed to students. Examine the case study, individual or in small groups with key questions being posed, active participation. You're giving out the case study step by step. You're telling them what you're doing. They're looking at it. Comprehension development. Students actually then, oh my gosh, they synthesize and they evaluate. I will bet my paycheck, which is small by the way, that these are higher level Blooms. You're having them look at it, you're having them analyze, evaluate the information, and discuss between the students and even you if you want to integrate yourself into the lesson. And then to check to see if the students are on task. Reinforcement. Students transfer the learning to a teacher-led discussion. And this is where you're having students, you're asking groups, what did you come up with? What did you do? Okay, what did you find in this? What was different between your group and that group? And you foster a discussion as you go through. And so what you can do is, you can even grade them if you had to, if you wanted to, on class participation. It's up to you on how you grade as a form of assessment. And most likely that would be a formative assessment being a daily grade versus summative being something that is more formal and summarizes what you've done in the entire unit. Okay? I'll give you an example of a case study that we have, and you have this in your actual module, so hopefully you printed this off. It's difficult to read sometimes, and I apologize for that. But I just want to run through this lesson, kind of the structure, and give you an idea of what we're looking at here. And like I said, I will post a couple examples of some case studies that I use, for example, Slinger Williams. I have a couple other case study examples that I'll post on the module itself. So up here, unit objective generalizations. I usually leave this out. I usually just leave this the way it is unless you have a textbook. If you're currently teaching and you know what you're going to be doing your unit over for the class, then put that up there. You can always open the textbook up and it'll tell you what those objectives are for each of the different chapters. Lesson objectives. Given the opportunity, students will be able to conduct the following objectives. A standard protocol right here. Number 1, students will describe. Can I measure a student describing something? Yes, I can. Number 2, students will compare and contrast. That should be underlined, but that is at the level of Bloom, comparing and contrasting. I can watch them compare something and contrast something back and forth. Students will formulate a possible preventative measure. Okay, you can measure the student formulating something. Now, you will notice down here, these are measurable. This is a goal. A goal here, students will understand the necessity of cities, such as Memphis, to be located on the river. Okay, can I measure a student understanding something? Technically, I cannot. That is a goal. It's something we ultimately want the students to be able to do when they leave doing this lesson, they understood something. Now, I can measure understanding by using these measurable objectives up here. And that's the key. That's what I want you to make sure you understand, that these are measurable, these are not. Okay? Standards. Here's a list of state standards. We have national NCSS standards, which you can find in your textbook. NCSS 3, people, places, and environment. So, what we've done here so far, measurable objectives, non-measurable goal, standards here, NCSS standards. Now, the one standards I'd like for you to put into your lessons from this point forward until we're told otherwise, it's going to be using some Common Core literacy standards, which I sent you a link in the module. Okay? Now, materials up here. Materials used in this lesson include the following. I always want you to be thorough. I know it sounds stupid, and you think, oh my gosh, can I just not bullet this stuff? But remember, this style of lesson plan and the new emphasis on trying to be very, very thorough in our lesson planning process requires us to be very thorough. So here we have case study material, we have information from National Geographic, the Science Monitor, and additional several YouTube videos that were shown in class. Simply doing this tells me, and it tells the teacher, if they pick up your lesson plan, these are the things that we're going to be using in the classroom. Background and rationale. This case study is designed to address the following issues with floods and impact on major cities. Here, what you're doing is, and I'm not going to insult you by reading this to you, is you're basically telling me why this lesson is important. Academic terms and languages. What language are we going to have here that might be something that would trip a student up? Why are we identifying this? Because we're identifying possible areas in our lesson that might cause issues that you might want to then emphasize even more. For example, preventative measure, water management, ecological preservation. Some students might not know what ecological preservation is, so you might kind of go through these terms as you're going through the lesson. And down here, this activity is the third of a lesson within the unit. Before this lesson, the teacher and the class had already discussed and analyzed the basic causes and effects of flooding. So this is important. This first sentence is important because it tells me, actually the first two sentences, tells me this is the third lesson out of 5 or 6. And this also tells me what had they done before this lesson. It tells me that they've built the foundation up. You just don't want to throw them into something where they're completely lost and they have nothing to kind of go back upon. Lessons should be scaffold. They should keep on going up and stacking upon each other. The lesson will reinforce why is this important. This lesson is important because it illustrates the difficulties in preventing major flooding. And it tells me why this lesson is important. So these two sections are very important. It tells me this is the pre-planning before you actually do your lesson. This tells an administrator, it tells a professor, it tells your peers, somebody that takes over the lesson, that you've planned and they've thought very thoroughly what could be some hiccups, what's this good for, and where does this fall within your unit. So keep that in mind as you write these lessons. And as always, like I've told you before, it's like beating a dead horse to a certain extent. I will look at this before they're due. You just got to give me time to give you feedback on it. Now, procedure. Okay? Introduction. Now this is part of your lesson plan, so nothing has changed. Now we're going to have some changes. I'm taking the case study approach, which is right here, which is something I talked about a couple slides back. And you'll notice these are the exact same steps we just talked about. For example, learning experience, case study distributed. Approximate time, I'm guesstimating here 20 minutes. I'm also guesstimating, if that's even a word, that our introduction takes around 5 minutes. Why is the times important? Why are we emphasizing times? It might be off. It could be way off. Because if you're teaching and somebody has good questions, or there's an interruption, intercom, whatever it is, a pep assembly, whatever it's going to be, these times could be all off, but it tells me that you're trying to strategically plan how long you think in your head this is going to work. It's preparing you mentally, also on paper, to be ready for this lesson. So what we did here, learning experience is distributed. And you'll notice here each group has, they've been formed, they've provided the information. They get 2 case studies, 1927 flood, and they also get the 2011 flood. And so they're going to compare these articles and compare the characteristics between the 1927 and 2011 flood. And then the students have questions as they read. Now this is also, it's part of the learning experience because you're asking the students to look at these particular areas. What we improved, what causes, and what do you think anything we can do to prevent it in the future. Comprehension and development, we're guessing around 10 minutes. The groups will discuss the damage that occurred in both floods. So we're having them compare and contrast, look at these 2 articles, read it, answer these questions, and now we're having them here actually break it down and say, after we've looked at this, what can we do? And for reinforcement, we're saying around 10 minutes, we're having a class discussion, and the emotions that were felt by the city of Memphis in 2011 when the flood came all the way up to certain areas of downtown and flooded areas all in the counties surrounding here. So you're noticing that we're using learning, comprehension, reinforcement, and our introduction is right up there. So you have all the different steps we want that we have for the case study lesson. Okay? Assessment evidence. Briefly, this lesson is a formative informal grade. When I say formative, it's going to be a daily grade. It's informal, meaning it's not going to be something that's a lasting, permanent test score. It's going to be a daily grade. No homework was given, okay? But here's something that's interesting. Students were evaluated in small groups in performance and presentation. Presentation should be underlined. So this is how we evaluate them. We said, I'm evaluating my students by performance, them doing it, and also them presenting in small groups what they came up with. That's how I'm grading them. That's the way. And somebody says, how did you grade the students? Well, I'm grading them on performance, them doing it, and presentation. Okay? No homework is given. Make sure that's clearly identified. Now, you're going to notice something here. This lesson dealt with historical and recent flooding events. You're going to notice these right here are the exact same 3 measurable objectives used at the very beginning of your lesson. Okay? All you're showing me is you're tying it back around. You're proving to me that you've gone full circle. Okay? So students were tasked to find preventative measures, and you kind of tell me what they had to do. So the assessment part, believe it or not, what people mess up the most, 2 things. They don't tell me it's formative. Actually, 3 things. They don't tell me how they assess the students, and they don't, for some reason, tie their measurable objectives back into this section of the assessment evidence. It's simple. You've already done it. Just tell me and write it back in there. Modifications. Auditory learners. Class discussion over case studies. Kinesthetic learners. Those who like to get up and move around. Hands-on design and implementation of flood control measures and demonstration discussed in class. Visual learners. Pictures of various floods. YouTube videos. So for the teachers, the students who like to see things visually, you've got something. For the students who like to get up and move around, you got something. For the auditory learners, you got something. From a diversity and multicultural standpoint, think about this. Based on classroom demographics, students might discuss how floods affect different regions of the world that might be vulnerable. For example, there's different areas in India that constantly flood. There's areas in the United States that are vulnerable to flooding. New Orleans, areas like that. So you could mix it up and look at it from a broader standpoint right here. Now, lastly, low-level and high-level learners. Well, for my students who are lower-level learners, which you'll have unless you have an advanced placement course, students reinforcement within groups, additional time on task if needed, explanation of events. So you're helping the students with their peers. If they also need additional support from you, you can give it to them. Remember, this is on paper. We're trying to show that we are planning for every possible outcome, any possible situation that we can think of that's legitimate right here. And higher level students create or even use their own preventative plan for additional cities. So if the students are advanced, you might have them actually design something in addition to what they had to do up here. But Lastly, you have, for any students who have IEPs or anything like that, you make sure you tell them all modifications we want according to the student's IEP program of study. You cannot go wrong here. Because if you start putting down Johnny, Sally's, Timmy's, and Mary Sue's accommodations, you're going to violate FERPA, and it just doesn't make sense because you use this lesson again, you got all their names on here. So you just simply, you're going to get a list from your SPED teacher, the person you're going to be working with, and they're going to tell you what these students need, and you just put this here as kind of a legal, I guess, a gap, a false thing to help you out in terms of any issues, okay? So if you don't have any questions, please continue to go forward. Like I said, this video was designed, you've got this lesson in front of you, hopefully you kind of went through it. If you need any more clarification or any issues whatsoever, please feel free to give me an email at the class email, and until then, I'll see you at the next lesson.